I was pretty busy being a disaffected teen and learning to drive and doing a bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to talk about on an academic panel. But I'm really grateful to be here because I found yesterday and today's discussions incredibly interesting and instructive and useful for me in thinking about the place of my work in kind of a much longer and broader trajectory of work. And I'm really grateful, Kevin, for you inviting me to participate. So Kevin asked us, as he mentioned, to spend some time on this panel reflecting on the last few days, which is a really difficult charge with very little lead time. But I'm going to do my best. So here's a few things that have struck me about the last few days. Yesterday, Tim Wu asked a question of Julie Cohen related to her talk on the shift from industrial to information capitalism. And he said, and I will paraphrase this poorly, but I don't think he's here, so I'll paraphrase it however I want. He said, do we not get as excited about these harms, or do we not maybe regulate them as acutely because like nobody's hand is getting crushed, right? This isn't quite the same as a factory. The harms of information capitalism are somewhat more diffuse and esoteric. And Gigi Sohn yesterday also raised the distance between the discourse at the sort of elite level and at the level of disadvantaged communities. Deirdre Mulligan earlier today raised a point about how amazing it is that we deploy algorithms in criminal justice without really knowing what it is that an algorithm is doing. And she posited that the reason we might stomach that so readily is because we're not the ones that the algorithm is doing it to. And then today, Helen, Siva, Brett, and Shoshana, all in different ways, but all very eloquently, touched on the relationship between technology and the fundamentals of humanity. So those are some threads that I'm going to try to pull together, and I'm going to make two quick points about them. And I'm a social scientist. I'm a sociologist by training, so I'm going to ground this in some empirical data because that's how I know how to think about these things. So both of my points here will have to do actually with intimacy, which is a research topic I've spent a lot of time on lately. I'm going to talk about the intimacy of contemporary surveillance capitalism. So you all know, and Yochai alluded to this a bit yesterday as well, but I'm sure you all know, right, that there's lots of concern about the impact of machine learning systems on employment, on the possibility of massively disrupted labor markets, lots of discussion about the extent of this disruption, the sectors it's most likely to impact first. And everybody seems to agree, or many economists seem to agree, that a prime target will be long-haul truck driving. And there are both technical reasons and social and political reasons for this. Obviously, as we all know, there have been tremendous technical innovations in autonomous vehicles. A lot of those technical innovations specifically kind of lend themselves to the style of driving that trucks do, highway-style driving. And then socially and politically, trucking is a highly regulated, centralized industry in some ways. And because of the way the industry is set up, which I won't get into here, human truckers tend to be hugely overworked and to be really tired. And when they get tired, they get fatigued and they cause lots of accidents. Machines don't get tired, right? So there's sort of a pull factor that way too. Now, economists worry a lot about the potential impact here, right? So NPR put out this graphic a few years ago. Folks may have seen it. I don't know how well you can read it. But it shows the most common job, according to BLS statistics, in every state. I think this was in 2014. And you can see that there's some artifacts of the data that make this not as clean as it actually looks. But the most common job in many, many states and all these kind of aqua states is truck driver. So there are about 2 million long haul. This is long haul. There are about 2 million long haul truck drivers in the US today. So the concern, of course, is what happens if in short order all of these jobs are lost. Now, I won't say I'm glad that people have started focusing on this, but in a way I am, because I've spent the last 6 years studying the relationship between technology and truck driving. It was the focus of my dissertation, and I've continued to work on it. And there certainly is, of course, right, a threat from automation here. But one thing I found quite striking, and which emerged in some of the conversations in the last few days, is that the rhetoric about massive job loss, to me, doesn't capture the whole nature of the threat, or even the most interesting part of the threat. So there won't be, I don't think, and I don't think many of you think, a discrete phase transition, right, from humans to robots. It doesn't go human, 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 robot all of a sudden. And in truck driving, that's the case too, right? Being a truck driver involves a whole lot of tasks that aren't just driving the truck, right? A whole bunch of stuff that may eventually be automatable, but won't be automatable in short order, right? Things like, loading the truck, securing a load, interfacing with customers, driving around in a yard, things like that. So there's still going to be a driver in the cab for a long time. It's clear that in the next few years, the nature of the work will change, but it's very unlikely that we will wholesale replace that worker. Instead, what we'll require truckers to do is to integrate their work with the technology, alluding to sort of this handoff issue that Helen and Deirdre and others have been working on. So we sometimes think about this as sort of this discrete sharing of tasks, right, in which a human hands the baton to the robot, and the robot does what it's good at, and then it gets handed back in some way. But what we actually see happening in trucking these days is not at all that sort of discrete handing off. We don't see a parceling out of functions. Instead, what we see is the integration of the human and the technology into one another in a really intimate bodily way. So in practice, the way workers are actually experiencing the threat of AI isn't displacement, but it's intrusion, this very gradual physical intrusion into their work and their bodies. And I'll tell you just very quickly some examples of what I'm talking about. This is a cartoon from a trucker magazine. And this article that it draws from, right, it's showing all these technologies, which are all actual, I think they're all actual technologies on the market, or related to, well, they're not. Coffee fuel injector isn't a real thing. But actually, I think that's the only one that isn't a real thing, maybe. I think so. So some examples brought up in that article and in other contexts, other research I've been doing about this. Mercedes recently announced it's working on a vest for truck drivers that monitors their heart rate and vital signs. And the vest knows, right, if the trucker is on the brink of a heart attack and stops the truck if he is. This is a company called Seeing Machines, which is one of several companies working in this space, which trains a camera on a driver to monitor his eyelids, right, to look for signs of fatigue or inattention. If the driver's eyes close or he looks away from the road, it'll send an alert to his boss. It can be programmed to text his family members. And my favorite part about it is that it causes the driver's seat to vibrate, so it kind of gooses the trucker back into awareness, back into attention. This is the smart cap. These drivers are wearing this hat, which essentially does a constant EEG on the trucker's brainwaves, also looking for signs of fatigue. If you get tired, it sounds an alarm. There's another version of this that will shine lights, bright flashlights in your face to try and wake you up. And there are other systems too. There are predictive analytics systems that look at what the trucker is doing both within the truck and potentially what else is going on in his life, which they infer from a bunch of different data points. So the key point I want to make here is the distance between these two narratives, right? The distance between these two forms of threat. Like, we focus a lot on this one and hardly at all on this other one, right? And it's not that this is wrong and this is right. I think they're both actual threats. But I think to substitute the narrative or to focus entirely on this narrative of displacement and to fail to recognize the narrative of intrusion in which the data gathering system is like literally like goosing your ass, right? Like, that's strikes me as a mistake, right? That strikes me as a limitation. So we should think about how in this work, which of course is low-wage work, right? These are not people making a bunch of money in the first place, but for them the intrusion of AI is quite intimate and embodied. It's this forced hybridization that really changes the nature of their work and lives. Now Bruce, who I think is here still, there's Bruce, and Siva, who I think is also here, although I don't know, maybe he's not.
Yeah,
okay, well, Bruce and Siva both made this point about the inherent physicality of computing now, and I couldn't agree more, right? I think this is a great instance of that, and it's important to note how that physicality is unevenly distributed, right? It's unevenly borne across society, and how visceral these systems are to people who are not us, right? So this is kind of the bloody side of this stuff. Relatedly, many of you may know that there's a Data for Black Lives conference going on at MIT right now. My assumption is that kind of these physical, intrusive, violent forms of data gathering are much more their concern than like the Tide button. So I just feel like that's really important to call out. Okay, second point, very quick, this is shorter. This is building from the first, right? So I'm emphasizing the physicality and intimacy of these systems for vulnerable people. I'm working with a team of researchers at Cornell, where I'm based, and at NYU, on the relationship between technology and intimate partner violence, or domestic violence. We've been working for about a year. There's a bunch of facets of the project that I won't get into now, related to how technology is used to facilitate abuse, potential ways that we might use technology to remediate it. I just want to make one point about this context here, which I think is relevant, again, to some of what Bruce was saying, which is that if you look at the tech-related risks that victims of intimate violence face, the typical ways that we have, or that I have at least, of thinking about privacy and security fall apart. The threat model is basically entirely different, right? Even though technology is involved. So this is very much, again, in line with what Bruce said. And the big difference is that the adversary is physically co-present with you, right? The big difference is physicality. So the person that you're kind of trying to avoid, or the person that's trying to harm you through technology, is not separate, is not in North Korea, right? Is not separated from you by undersea cables. The person is there with you. So I'll talk just very quickly about a few of the key differences that we're finding in the work. One is kind of the risk of the blank slate, right? So often in privacy or security, if you're at risk, what we tell people is, if your integrity is compromised, like close your account and reopen a new one, cut up your credit card, change your password, like all these kind of straightforward pieces of advice to insulate yourself from the invasion. And it turns out that this is like fraught and sometimes terrible advice in the intimate partner violence context for a bunch of reasons. But one of the reasons is that disconnection can really greatly escalate your bodily risk, right? So weirdly, in some ways, it actually can be advantageous for victims of intimate partner violence to maintain some technical connection or some technological, digitally mediated connection to an abuser because it keeps the abuser from potentially coming and hurting them physically. So in some sense, you actually don't want to overprotect against tech-mediated abuse in some situations, right? Another difference is that when your adversary is intimate, it changes the nature of authentication, which is also something that I feel like this was a great, like Kevin really did a great job with this, like it's a great point of connection. So in a lot of contexts, we tend to think of an attacker doesn't know you personally, the attacker's connecting from elsewhere, but in intimate partner violence, the attacker can compel disclosure of your access credentials quite easily, right? You may share a computer with that person may own your account, right, may own your phone. The account might be a family plan, right? They can guess your security questions. They have your password. They can threaten you to get it. So the kind of obvious privacy and security authentication rules are just totally inapplicable here. Access credentials end up being basically meaningless. Spyware is a really big issue too, which many of you know. There's a lot of concern about the installation of apps that surreptitiously detect connection, location, communications, things like that. But there's also a big issue with what we call dual-use apps, which are things that we all use, things that are really common, like Find My iPhone, Find My Friends, parent trackers for kids, stuff like that, many of which can be used sort of off-label for surreptitious tracking. And our research is showing that advertising actually often suggests these uses, right? So if you search for track a cheating boyfriend on the Google Play Store, you get this ad for a parental tracker suggesting some algorithmic linkage between the two. And note again that this is off-the-shelf software. Like you don't have to be a hacker to install this. Like it's very easy to get access to this. So the reason I'm talking about this here is to emphasize, again, what happens when computing not only gets physical, but gets intimate. So sure, like Bruce pointed out, like now it can kill you, right? That's a big difference. But it also has to contend with this whole other set of social actors, right, who aren't programmers or hackers. They're your trucking boss, or they're your abusive partner. And the system of surveillance capitalism that Julie has alluded to and that Shoshana alluded to, that political economy trickles down into these relationships, right? It reverberates downward into these social relations. And that often happens to the detriment of the most vulnerable people in our population. That's it.
I don't have any slides.
That's right.
At the dinner last night, it was at a restaurant called the Dandelion, and it was placed, the logo of the Dandelion, above the digital tornado and after the digital tornado. So it's a sticky metaphor. I want to use it. The tornado is where we are, and I think we've been going through that a lot, and the Dandelion is what we're fighting for. It is frail, it is beautiful, and if we succeed, we'll be rewarded with wine and coffee and nourishment and vitality. But the deck is totally stacked against the dandelion, that lone flower. I love the post-apocalyptic image that Christian accidentally found for the tornado. I have to say, the last 2 days make me feel like the tornado is just what we're facing. Shoshana's riveting topo analysis of the sanctuary made dust. So let's see if we can conjure from the contours of the tornado a space of life and light. What did I learn about the tornado? From Julie and Siva, that our scholars have spent enough time in these hands-off parlor games of what's to blame, technology, law, the internet, humanity. We need to get much more precise rather than these useless binaries. The story of the 20-year tornado, I'd say, is not built on these three pillars we've been talking about of networks, humanity, and algorithms. The interesting, darker story, and I liked the comments throughout the last 2 days from Sean Park, is much more about dark money, rampant testosterone, and slick, devastating strategy, particularly what Julie so persuasively set up about entrepreneurial, legal, institutional appropriation strategies, regulatory arbitrage. the productive and controversial mobilization and counter-mobilization of law proactively as well as retroactively, and crucially, the correlative disabilities on information users. From Gigi, I heard how naive we were. Competition is just not a given. We need rules. We have 4 ISPs effectively, where we once had 7,000, and Tim Wu's documented that impressively. The choice for startups is be Facebook or be eaten by Facebook. And those startups and the sharks that inhale them are building dossiers on us that we can't do anything about. From this morning's session, in the new domains of AI, blockchain, Internet of Things, I think we face, as Kevin said, catastrophic failures with no clear remediation and creeping re-centralization, the worst of all worlds. And I think there's a little risk as we start to navigate those spaces as academics of getting into a spin of views, a new vortex. We risk becoming self-cancelling noise in our different definitions of what we're fighting for. I absolutely love the subtleties of what Christian and Deirdre are pushing for, but to outsiders who don't know the different subtleties of what they're fighting for around contestability or transparency, it starts to lose some of the central terrain of what we really want. I heard a major caution from Bruce and Sally that when everything is a computer, just with different peripherals, and they have velocity, mass, and heat, and they are in us and carrying us, every other policy concern pales because we're just trying to survive. So I think that actually reduces significantly the space from what we might have been talking about 20 years ago, and we really need to re-energize, reanimate the much bigger stakes that Brett, Shoshana, and Helen really talked about today. What's the point of saving our bodies if we don't save ourselves? Information capital bearing down on our homes and our bodies, it seduces us, programming us, predetermining our options, and it has this seductive allure of removing uncertainty and inefficiency. Pretty devastating analysis from Shoshana of no backstage, no exit, no walls, no corners. And these systems that are radically indifferent to our humanity are, I think, quite rightly, things that we should consider unendurable, and they should make us indignant. One of the things about staying alive, and I'm so happy to follow from Karen, I felt that we spoke throughout the 2 days very elliptically about people and about the rest of the world. And another kind of blind spot, I think, is often around infrastructure and energy. Nobody talks about the spectacular environmental cost of machine learning. Helen warned of how we're making our bodies standing reserves. And, you know, as Karen just pointed out, scheduling technology, which many people face, already does just that. So enough of the tornado. The dandelion, is there one? I loved Yochai setting the example for many other confessions to say that lovable old guys can change their minds and say we were sometimes overly optimistic, and then just beautifully outline what is at stake and where we need to be more positive and conscious of limits of what's gone before. From Shoshana, even mighty power, sharks like we've never seen, we can get up close to. We can define them. There is, in fact, a sociology of the unprecedented. We can name it, get close to it, and with prodigious energy blast it apart. I love her little comment there, truly bollocks to inevitability. So from Brett, I love this, it's only a lack of imagination that stops us considering alternate futures. So I wanted to just pick up a few ideas that I thought were promising. I want many more. I know that we all have lots of ideas of things we want to work on. I think Helen tempted that noxious weed spirit of the dandelion. If we're standing reserves to systems, we have no obligation to be true, legible, and readable to them. I love that she dwelled on Heidegger, and that, I think, came through this afternoon. Our tools we use without necessarily reflecting on them, but they are ontologically prior to science. We've got a lot of science that we can still navigate. I love that Christian pointed out how much we need to respect and bring together the disciplines and find bridges between them. I think Tim had this nice idea that technology law should all sunset, and it means that channeling late Benkler, we can have governments that move fast and break things with what I'd term combustible laws. You know, set them for 5 years, and then we don't have to have regret that we regulated for the small guys, and they've subsequently become big guys. I think Christian, Ellen, and Kathy all put out that we need more exciting agendas for what we're doing in machine learning. And I think, just as a plug, like in my comments, I think there's lots of work to be done, and we should really take a lot of value from works of synthesis. There's a risk that I'm very conscious of the difference of US academia, where there's such a push to sort of build your own tower in the sky, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in sort of shouting out to so much of the rich scholarship that's gone before. I really, from SIVA, there's this moment, I think, of opportunity, and this also came through in Shoshana's. As we move from technology as the technology of the desktop, he kind of put it, to the embedded, there's this spatial transition, and it does give us a little bit of an opportunity of a phase shift. I think within it we can, and there was that great comment about slowness, a push for slowness, of entropy, inconvenience, friction. What does that look like, and how do we save it from looking too much like what Kathy said, of losing the efficiencies that we want to have? And the final idea that I wanted to just come back to is that Victor posited an idea of, which Joe Thoreau usefully pointed out, had a small information privacy problem of having progressive data sharing. And I think our community, and I'd be so fascinated from people here, cleaves on a crucial point. And it's whether and what we do about the mass accumulation of data hoards. Do we legitimate them and then tranche them off and give back some tiny proportion of data? Or do we recognize it for what it is, an epic data heist from 5 big tech companies on our humanity? Thank you.
All right, so I have a PowerPoint, but I'm not sure how to get it on.
Let's see. Yeah, if you can you email it to me?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
I
then we
probably
can-
should have talked to you about this in advance.
That's okay. We can do this on the fly.
So yeah, so I've got it. What's your email?
We're back.
Oh yeah, actually
you're
it's the
back,
same as usual,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The one that you've been. People are probably going to flee as I do this, but you know, it's
Yeah, let's
fine.
give us 1 second.
It's cool.
Yeah.
You guys, let's do this.
We could even take while we're doing this, we could even a question or comment from the audience. Let's just take a minute, but
good.
not. Yeah.
Good improvisation.
Anyone? Yeah.
And ask, like, also could technically, is this on? Hello?
I don't think so.
What do I do?
No, it's
I sent it to you, and now we can get it on the screen. Where do we put it? We put it here. Is it actually making me any louder?
yeah. Yeah, it's
Okay.
for recording. Yeah, I got it.
Great,
Okay.
great. Oh, it's for recording. Okay, so
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter if it's making me any louder. Now, does it? Well, I mean, in a way it does, because you might not be able to hear me, but maybe I don't want to be heard. Well, I actually do want to be heard. I have a lot
No, I've got
of
the
awesome
same
things to say.
Weird thing where it's going into the other menu.
You know, I'm actually wearing the exact same outfit right now that I was wearing in that photo. So, you just put this over there. So I was like, well, Lauren, you might need to spice things up. I mean, I like this outfit.
At
So,
least it wasn't taken 20 years ago.
All right, so
well, you know, I'm still wearing the same clothes and they still function. So that's
got
good.
the same thing. We won't go into presentation mode, but you can just, it'll go back and forth.
Oh,
like
no,
this,
no.
okay?
Yes, to
Okay,
go
good.
back and forth like that. And
Okay.
it's not on the screen
Oh,
now.
right, yeah.
So.
You actually want to see it? Yeah.
Also,
How about that?
I bleed Bulldog blue, and Yale beat Harvard today, so that's also good news. And the best part of today, though, is going to be this presentation. So I'm going to be as brief as I can be, but I have some big points to make here. I'm going to do a little bit less actual name checking than my other members of the panel. I think I'm going to be referring sort of broad themes that people have been talking about today, but trust, even if I didn't name check any particular person, everything kind of influenced my analysis here. So I'm going to really concentrate on looking to the future, sort of the question, what is to be done, and how should we approach doing it? I don't have the answer to what we should do, but I have some procedural ideas. So 2 themes that have been going through this conference is basically the future is hard to predict. When we read the original article that we're sort of centering our analysis around, there was a kind of this hopeful idea about what might happen with the internet, wanting to save infant industries, thinking about the kind of place the internet could be, all that stuff. And even though it's like even the best laid plans, even the smartest people couldn't necessarily predict exactly how this stuff would play out. So the future is hard to predict no matter who's doing the prediction. So the second problem that came up is how do we get past the post-New Deal hopeful punt policy move? So here's what I mean by that. This isn't actually a term of art. It's basically, ever since the New Deal promised, okay, we'll get an administrative state, we'll have technocrats, and they'll know exactly what to do, and then we don't have to make value judgments anymore. The New Deal, well, the administrative smart people fix everything. So a lot of people didn't like how the New Deal went, and that's why we got the Reagan Revolution. And then they were like, oh great, the free market, we'll just give everything to the free market, and then we don't have to worry about making value judgments anymore, because the market will bring us to what we need and want. So that's kind of failed too. The idea of, the Laffer curve and all that stuff, Republicans are getting increasingly hysterical with sort of the way in which they point to their views about tax policy. Because unlike in the 80s, where it was a theory that if we gave everything to the free market, everyone will end up better off, it seems like in practice of years and years of doing this, that's just not what has happened. So we might not care about wealth distribution, but Reagan said a rising tide will lift all boats, and the data says that what didn't happen. So the free market and really big companies kind of have ended up failing us in a variety of ways. So the free market ends up not being so free, oligarchs pop up, but maybe the really big companies are quite smart, like Late Schumpeter might postulate, but they fail us sometimes. We look at the decline of Microsoft to being a invidious monopolist, to Apple producing worse and worse products and having more and more dongles. So the really big companies have kind of failed ourselves in a way. And now we even have social media and the wisdom of crowds. That not to say, by calling them fallen, it's not to say that they haven't provided us with good things, but none of them have turned out to be the infallible source of moral judgment and truth and getting us to the right way. If we just give it to them, we will get a good answer. They've all failed in that department. And so we talked about social media, about how ethno-nationalism's on the rise now, and how, and even in the most recent discussions, how these platforms are created and they can be exploited, not just by the creators of the platforms, but by others. When Karen was talking about how sort of stalkers and abusive partners can take advantage of the quantified self and the surveillance environment. So, and now the newest thing is blockchain. So maybe everything, if we make it a blockchain, everything will be okay. But I think that all of these have failed us. We can't just say, visionaries is another example. Visionaries, maybe us circa 2007, sort of scholars, people who are policy wonks, all these people practicing and litigating cases. Maybe, they know best, but as it turns out, the best and brightest thinking about it in the best possible ways with the information available, we're having this conference now being like, hey, we were wrong about a lot of this stuff. So I think any visionary is limited. In a way, we all sort of have tunnel vision. All of these things have tunnel vision because they're trying to achieve certain goals, and they can't actually get past the situation that they're in and be omniscient. So cooperation is necessary. I don't know if any of you guys know what this is, but this is a video game called Overwatch, and it's actually, you can get pretty good values from video games insofar as in this video game you have to do a team fight, and they actually allowed in beta people of different, to make any type of team that they wanted, but it actually turns out that you need support heroes and tanks and offensive heroes. And to say that we only want to rely on markets, or we only want to rely on government, or we only want to rely on academia is not good. In fact, they all need to cooperate. So I think that while this is sort of whimsical way of thinking about, okay, maybe the answer is some sort of cooperation. But cooperation isn't enough either, because we do this too. It's like, why don't we get everyone in a room? Well, let's put everyone in a room and then do what? Oh, by the way, this is my main Overwatch character. I dressed up as her as Halloween. You can, if you're Facebook friends with me, you can see it. But my main proposition here, my affirmative thing, is that the way to approach major technological change is by going back to basics. So prior to the New Deal, it was conventional wisdom that no one actor in society could really have the truth in terms of how to fix things, because they were more comfortable making value judgments, for one thing. There was the idea of finding the truth in the common law. If you look at the structure of American government, we have checks and balances, 3 different sources of reason, 3 different ways of governing, and a huge amount of governance at that time, furthermore, on top of checks and balances, was done by the states. So we need to get away from this idea of infallibility and more of one actor in society, be it technologists. But that's still, the back to basics means this procedural toolkit. And you'll notice if you think about it, I mean, these are tools that are associated with traditional common law lawyering and up until very recently philosophy. But you'll notice that there's no reason that this can't be done by a machine, and there's no reason why we can't take into account empirical data in doing this. So first of all, there's my first point. Like, we need to get to basic general principles. I think the reasoning behind the punt move is that, well, it gets harder and harder in an increasingly diverse society to actually say, this is right and this is wrong. We have this policy because we want this goal. We believe these things about humanity. We think it's important that everyone has X, Y, and Z. This is why people want to always say, oh, it's transparency. Oh, like we want everyone to have all the choices available so they can make their own choice. But ultimately, it's just not getting us there. And I think we need to start having a baseline of what we're talking about when we're thinking about how we want people to relate to one another, not just in society, but also in the context of business. I teach contracts and commercial law, and people think of that who don't actually work in the area as some type of cold libertarian area, but actually if you read the UCC, it's undergirded with the idea of basic commercial good faith. And the common law is actually one of the few areas which is actually built on the idea of basic moral reasoning. So this could actually be a resource for people trying to bring values back into the discussion. And the technology is really interesting. We talked about technology a lot. We had tech talks, but we're not going to get good policies just by getting the policymakers and the people who really understand the technology in the room. A lot of times, policymakers who don't want to make choices, they go to the tech person and they say, what should I do? And the tech person is like, well, I mean, I was trained to code and build systems. This isn't the typical type of moral reason. Like, I wasn't trained to do moral reasoning. And I think that what we really need to think about is it's the policymaker, it's the lawyer, it's the philosopher, it's the economist, it's whoever who actually needs to come to the table being like, okay, what affirmatively is our goal? And yes, you should bring in order to execute that goal and to modify the goal, we should be talking with people in the context of technology. But you have to have a principle to begin with. And the second point brings me to the idea of reflective equilibrium. So reflective equilibrium is effectively when you start with a principle, you look at a case, you apply it to the case, and then you change the principle based on what you see. That's how the common law works, and actually that's how machine learning works. That's why machine learning is so much more sophisticated than previous forms of computer reasoning. It's imitating the ways that humans have in the past dealt with our most difficult problems. And ironically, maybe these same algorithms could help us out of this if we bring it to bear, but we have to start with basic ethical principles. We can't just say, oh, well, we don't even know. You will not just get there unless you have a basic belief in the infallibility of one of these fallen gods. You must believe one of them did not fall. But I'm of the belief that they all are not sufficiently. So first of all, what is re-emphasizing basic ethical principles? And you can get those from anywhere. I like to start from the common law simply because they have a particular standing in American society. They already exist. They underpin multiple sources of law, even if they're no longer the governing law. The definitions in our statutory law often draw from the common law. And they have a particular standing in society. So that's why, but they can be modified. But that's why I start there. But you could start elsewhere. But anyway, what does re-emphasizing these tools allow us to do? Well, first of all, let me explain what I'm not arguing. I'm not arguing that common law is a replacement for statutory or administrative law. There are certain things that statutory law and administrative law are simply better at. But what am I arguing? So there are two versions of my argument. There's the weak version, and then there's the strong version. So the weak version is effectively that any actor in this space, whether you're a C-level executive at an information company, which is all companies now, a policymaker, an academic, you should be thinking in this way. So it's not about both sides. You have to start from a principle, look at, what the facts on the ground, and then use it to change that principle. And I think sometimes people get so caught up in the details that they can't abstract to a high enough level of generality that those same points will be relevant 20 years later. So you have to be at a higher level of generality. So thinking in this way would allow us to create, well, it allows us, but I mean, this is actually more, prescriptive. Like, we should have rules pitched at a high level of generalization that are nimble enough to deal with a broad range of situations. And as I said before, referencing common law is a strong way of raising ethical principles and policy making as a starting point. Of course, the common law by definition is not static, it's always changing, but it's just sort of a starting point and a reservoir of the sort of moral sort of place that society is at any given time. But the strong version, and this is sort of relates to sort of my research project as they are, is that the common law as is practiced in state courts and as when federal courts act as common law courts actually matters quite a lot. It actually can do a lot of good in society, and here's how. First of all, it is itself a backstop and a way of directly regulating things when there are no administrative bodies available. Creative interpretation of law that's on the books or in the common law can actually be capacious enough to have an approach to very, very new and sophisticated problems. So two examples briefly from my work is I have a paper called Algorithmic Contracts where I use agency law to talk about why it is that contracts formed by algorithms on behalf of companies or individuals should be seen as enforceable. And it seems pretty obvious that they should be, but there are actually, under current law, arguments available that they could say that somebody could argue that an contract made by algorithm, it's if a significant amount of responsibility is given to the algorithm, and if it's at a sufficient level of sophistication, sort of black box, that perhaps it's too far to meet the intent requirement that we think is part of contract law. But if we use agency theory and we think of algorithms as quasi-agents, we can close that loop. Another example of this, and this is my current paper, is thinking about privacy remedies. And there's a huge issue with Spokane and the like about how can privacy cases make it into court if you can't show harm, or if you can't persuade a judge that the harm is important enough? And that sort of shows a complete myopia in certain parts of the sort of judiciary, because you should not have to show harm to get into court if your cause of action is actually a case of unjust enrichment, which is when someone profits wrongly from someone else's stuff, regardless of whether or not there's harm. And if courts act, it spurs legislatures to reinforce or correct the decisions that are being made. So we wouldn't have the New Deal if there weren't a potpourri of cases all around in the early 20th century, culminating with Lochner, trying to grapple using pre-industrial age law, common law, with the industrial age. And as a result of that tornado and the judiciary's response, we got the New Deal. So I think that the information and the sort of talking about the situation on the ground in ways that policymakers can more readily respond to, as opposed to things that are outside the courts, would be very useful in getting us moving and actually being able to tackle problems, because we're still unable to tackle problems because we feel like we lack the information that have been going on for the past 25 years. So basically, to close it up, if we're going to move forward and try to address the problems in the digital age, we need a return to thinking about values and creatively using reflective equilibrium, whether it's in the common law courts or outside. There's no substitute for human reasoning and conscious choices about our value in society, and that is that.
Thank you. Great. So please give a hand to all three of these folks for taking on a very difficult task. So given that we are now just about at the time that we were supposed to wrap up and go